Taking a live look at the White House and tracking all of the latest updates coming out of Washington, D.C. As we know that President Trump repeated his complaint about NATO after a closed-door meeting with the alliance's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, just yesterday. That was for discussions that have been expected to be aimed at soothing Trump's anger with the military alliance over the Iran war. The Associated Press saying that ahead of the private meeting, President Trump had suggested the U.S. may consider leaving the transatlantic alliance after NATO member countries ignored his call to help as Iran effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz, a vital shipping waterway, and it has sent gas prices soaring. Also taking a look at a social media post from the White House on X, they are including a screenshot of a post from President Trump via Truth Social. President Trump saying, quote, "NATO wasn't there when we needed them, and they won't be there if we need them again. Remember Greenland, that big, poorly run piece of ice." President DJT. A lot to discuss this morning, so joining us next onto the program is going to be Alp Savim-Lefsoy, the Defense Policy Specialist and Atlantic Council Millennium Fellow. Alp, good morning. Good to have you on.
Well, good morning. I hope you're keeping well. Thank you for having me. When we're looking at this topic with Mark Rutte, it's crucial that we have our NATO allies on board, notably the UK, the Republic of Turkey, France. But we have to also underline the fact that President Trump has commanded what has been an exceptional military campaign. And so the U.S. can go it alone, but together with its allies, it can do much, much more.
And I just want to go ahead and reference again that social media post from the White House. So basically kind of breaking down the gist there about Secretary Rutte coming here to D.C., the primary objectives that he's having here. Also, we're waiting to see if these talks were ultimately successful. But I want to talk a little bit about, some of the conflict that we've seen come up because of this war that the U.S. and Iran are now engaged in. And Alp, if you could just break down for us really briefly, what limitations does NATO actually face in their ability to engage in conflicts like this U.S. and Iran confrontation?
Well, I think, Carol, it's a little bit to do with political concealment here. If we're looking at the strategic review that was conducted by the UK a few years ago, it highlighted that many naval vessels, for example, of the Royal Navy, were not seaworthy, let alone battle-worthy. So it highlights the need for our allies to continue spending more, a key aspect that has been underlined by President Donald J. Trump. And at the same time, it also indicates that many of our allies lack the necessary number of troops. I mean, we've seen talk about conscription returning in Germany. We've seen the same occurring in the UK and in France. And so this underlines a key desire by the transatlantic alliance, headed by the US, to get its allies up to scratch. So I think some of the non-desire displayed by our allies with regard to Iran has been more to do with their internal preparations with regard to defense spending rather than the US's campaign against Iran, which has been massively successful in dismantling the IRGC's ability to project power in its region.
So not only are NATO allies keeping a focus here on the war that continues in the Middle East, but primarily also the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, Alp, we've seen some reporting suggest that U.S. focus on the Middle East may divert attention from resources dedicated to Ukraine in their fight. How significant of a risk is that, particularly from a NATO perspective?
Well, the biggest risk is to do with having a firm end to the war in Iran as soon as possible. Why? When we're looking at our military assets in the Middle East, we have to reposition them in the future to the Pacific in order to counter the People's Republic of China, and especially with regard to the defense of Taiwan. To do that, we have to eliminate the threat that's emanating from the IRGC before. And the same goes with regard to Ukraine. We have placed significant military assets in the hands of the Ukrainian security forces in their valiant fight against the Russian Federation. However, the pressing topic right now is Iran, and we have to prepare to place ground troops in Iran in the event of a breakdown in talks, because the end to this conflict will not come about via a counterparty such as the IRGC. There is another army in Iran, known as the Artesh, the conventional army of Iran, that would make an ideal partner on the ground, such that, unlike Gulf War II, after a successful shock and awe campaign, we would have a local army that would keep the peace and ensure that we don't have to stay there for many years to come.
We are taking a live look here at a radar system courtesy of marine traffic. This is just showing some of the vessel movement there within the Strait of Hormuz. One of the key focuses here for President Trump, and also one of the asks that the president had of NATO allies in order to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. He was trying to get some of that support there. Given that, how are European allies also responding to U.S. frustration over their participation when trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and take control of that situation, so to speak?
Well, I think, primarily Keir Starmer has to do more. The UK is still a significant power. Now, we've talked about the Royal Navy's limitations, but from a signals and intelligence perspective, when we're looking at the Five Eyes alliance, the UK is very capable. So President Trump could speak to the UK about having its allies function within their specializations. So with regard to the UK, we could have more of an emphasis on intelligence. With regard to France, we could ask them to bring forward their aircraft carriers to the Straits of Hormuz, because this frustration that we're referring to, that President Trump has towards the US's European allies, NATO allies, it's also to do with the fact that many of these allies are more affected by the events than the US is. The US has energy independence. Many NATO allies do not. And we have to position NATO so that it is not a reactive alliance, as we've seen with regard to the war in Ukraine, but from now on, it's a proactive alliance. And the war in Iran is a great opportunity to reposition NATO for this.
Speaking of UK Prime Minister Starmer, I want to showcase this, a social media post from him. I believe it's the most recent one. He says the 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran today is welcomed by the UK and our allies. The goal now must be a lasting end to the war. Alongside our international partners, the UK will work to ensure a return to freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. And I also want to reference this, a social media post courtesy of the Wall Street Journal. Just going back to the relationship that the U.S. currently has with NATO. They say this, exclusive, the Trump administration is considering a plan to punish some members of the NATO alliance that he believes were unhelpful to the U.S. and Israel during the Iran war, according to administration officials. Alp, to what extent do some of these disagreements over this Iran conflict reflect deeper tensions within NATO?
Well, NATO is the most effective military alliance known to man. It has kept the peace after the Second World War. It has kept the peace during the Cold War. But now, when we move into a new age of great power competition, especially with regard to the CCP in China and with regard to this current conflict in Iran, we have to ensure that our allies are keen with regard to taking military action. It can't always be the US that is on the front line leading the objectives for the NATO alliance, as well as the US. We have to push NATO allies forward. And so, yes, there will be some behind-the-scenes negotiations, but I think NATO will hold and NATO will become stronger through US intervention with regard to bringing allies to the forefront of this conflict.
Secretary General Rutte had some of those behind-the-scenes conversations yesterday with President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Today, though, he will be participating in a moderated discussion still in Washington, D.C. So, Al, what will you be watching out for during that discussion, and what should our viewers really listen closely for?
Well, I think what we should pay attention to, one, intelligence cooperation. Two, what will be the specific roles that NATO allies take? For example, will we have the UK policing the Straits of Hormuz? Will we have French carriers that will take military action? Will we have a commitment from the UK, the Republic of Turkey, France, with regard to contributing ground troops in parallel with the United States, as well as these local forces I've mentioned within Iran that could be very useful to us, such that we could place a generalissimo from the Artesh as a future leader, These will be the key aspects that we have to pay attention to, because the UK is capable from an intelligence standpoint. The Republic of Turkey is the supreme power of its region with regard to military power. France is a credible maritime power, and the US is the sole superpower that has military capacity on the global scale. China doesn't have that. These are the aspects that we have to pay attention to. And when it comes to Iran, we have to ensure that these commitments are set in stone.
Alp Savin Basoy, a defense policy specialist and Atlantic Council Millennium Fellow. We appreciate your time this morning here at Live Now from Fox to talk specifically about NATO, but also how the conflict in Iran is kind of shaping these alliances and what we can expect. We hope to talk soon.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.